Talking today to Richard Lapper, who is the principal of Brazil Confidential, which is a research organisation devoted to looking at the Brazilian economy and political economy. Richard, back in the 1970s, development economists like Samir Amin and Andre Gunder Frank were describing the Third World as on the periphery of the global economy, with all the value being exported to developed economies. What's happened since then that Brazil has become the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world, depending on how you calculate GDP?
Well, I think, looking back on it, it's quite interesting. I mean, even in the 1970s, there was something slightly anachronistic about Andre Gunder Frank. I remember I was a sociology student at the time at Liverpool University, and Andre Gunder Frank was kind of sort of seen as the kind of gospel of development economists, and very much, the sort of fundamental thing you had to read, and so on and so forth. I mean, there was a lot of stuff around, Eduardo Galeano, and the sort of this idea of Latin America being a kind of an export economy completely exploited by the imperialist centre. It fitted in. It was a quite nice black and white categorisation of the region. And even at the time, it was wrong. Yeah, I mean, even at the time, Bill Warren, who was a socialist thinker, member of the Communist Party of Britain and Ireland, I think,
suitably obscure.
Completely obscure. Yeah. He wrote a very important pamphlet, I remember, in 1975, which I picked up somewhere on Tottenham Court Road, Advanced Capitalism, Backward Socialism. And this pamphlet basically argued that very many developing economies were already developing. They were going beyond their peripheral status. And he was referring really to countries like South Korea and Taiwan. And of course, these countries had basically ramped themselves up on an export economy, manufacturing exports, and on state intervention and various other things. But I think that, even at the time, the metropolis periphery idea was wrong. What's happened since then, I think, has only underlined that. I mean, you've obviously had the emergence of, South Korea has gone on from strength to strength. You've got China, which has, completely changed direction in its economic development. It is now a massive economic power. And then large parts of Southeast Asia are progressing really well. And so we're getting the emergence of Asian capitalism really is part of it. And I think Latin America is to be seen in the context of a reordering of the world. I mean, several things have happened in Latin America that are important. First of all, in the 1990s, Latin America succeeded in stabilizing its internal economies. Inflation, hyperinflation, had been the cause of instability economically throughout the 1980s and early 90s, and we'd had that period of, I remember when I used to write about these things in the 80s, thinking how many countries had gone through periods of hyperinflation where you'd had more than 1,000% inflation a year, and you can think back to Bolivia and Nicaragua
and Argentina.
Notably Argentina, and there was that period during the late 1980s when countries went from one adjustment plan to another. They'd abolished their currency, they'd go to another currency. There was the Cruzeiro, there was the Cruzado, then there was the Novo Cruzado. They tried to do it through sleight of hand, really, tried to change as if inflation was simply a matter of expectations, try and shift expectations. And it didn't work at that stage. And what really happened was that in the 90s, they started addressing the fundamental problems, which were fiscal imbalances. They started getting away from quick fixes, establishing a fixed exchange rate, basically importing what was then low US inflation into your own economy. They started getting away from quick fixes and started addressing fundamental problems and getting their fiscal accounts into balance. And that depended on large part in addressing the difficulties that had stemmed from the way the state of development developed in most Latin American countries during the 1950s, 60s, 70s and early 80s. So it was a period of, it's seen as a period of neoliberalism. And I don't like the term neoliberalism because I think it it clothes a number of different experiences in terms of political economy in one covering, if you like. I mean, I just don't think it helps you understand the distinctness of many of these Latin American experiences. But the commonality was that, Latin America stabilized, and it defeated hyperinflation. Now, on the back of that, I think you've seen during the last 10 to 15 years in most Latin American societies a progressive democratization in a process of slow, uneven economic development, but a process in which poverty levels have been reduced. Many people have risen from marginal social classes to it's not a middle class as we would describe it in the West, in Europe or the US. These people, the middle classes of Latin America don't enjoy those levels of spending that we would see as normal, but they are integrated into consumer economies for the first time. And this is really, really important. So we've had economic stability and the integration of large groups, millions of people really, into a consumer class, a class that Brazilians describe as classe C, which is the C class in the ABCD socioeconomic divisions. This is the big group, the middle group of the population that's grown. The people who earn, on average, people who earn between around about $800 a month, family income of $800 a month in your middle class, up to $2,000, $2,500 a month. They're not really that well off, but they have access to the consumer economy. They eat things like yogurt, they eat things like lettuce, they eat things, like wholemeal bread, things like that. They like iPhones. They buy cars on hire purchase agreements. In Brazil, they buy cars on 7-year-long hire purchase agreements, which are
quite long.
Indicates how stretched they become. But so what you've got are these two fundamental movements in Latin America, and now I think just to emphasise that point, economic stability, macroeconomic stability, relative stability, and the gradual growth of the consumer economy. The question now is,
I want to bring you on to the political side of the equation. What impact that's had. In the 1970s, the military were pitted against left-wing social movements in many countries in Latin America. What has changed that Dilma Rousseff, both a former guerrilla and a woman, has become president of Brazil?
Well, I think to answer that question, you've got to go back to the 70s, and initially the failure of military governments to sort out the problem. It's interesting, Pinochet by the right is characterised as being, the sort of great founder of Chilean success, and in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Chile's success and most of its macroeconomic, and you have to say that Chile is probably without question, not probably, without question, is the most successful Latin American economy. Chile's success is based on the democratic governments that took office after Pinochet's departure. The conciliation, the alliance of Christian and social democracy that have led Chile until the last election when the right returned to power, but a very different right to the right that Pinochet was associated with. Now, I think that the militarist failure, step by step, democratic politicians have, begun to embrace the policies necessary to secure stability. There's been a realization by the left that hyperinflation, indeed high levels of inflation, are principally prejudice the social groups who vote for the left, and in particular those social groups, the informal sectors that are outside full-time work and didn't benefit didn't benefit from union negotiations to keep wages ahead of price increases and so on. So it was these more marginal groups that have benefited, that vote heavily for the left, that have benefited most from the conquest of hyperinflation. And that's why you see and have seen in this emergence of a round of left-wing governments from the beginning, at the end of the 1990s, throughout the 2000s, a commitment to macroeconomic stability. You look at Uruguay, you look at Chile, you look at Argentina, where perhaps in a slightly, there's a little caveat to be added there at some point in this discussion. You look at Brazil most clearly, at Bolivia, where these countries, despite their very, very different kinds of left, I mean, inflation is not something they're going to embrace openly. I think the nearest we're seeing to, I think Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is something of an exception to this rule.
So they bought fiscal orthodoxy at some level.
I think they bought the idea of fiscal stability. You know, you can't simply let the state grow inexorably to solve social problems. That you've actually got
you can't let the printing presses run.
You can't let the printing presses run. You've got to have some kind of monetary and fiscal stability, and that has been the big shift in the left. And I think, you know, it's not widely recognised that Lula clearly embraced those policies, and he represents that kind of social democratic left.
But he combines that with the social programmes.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's the other interesting thing, that what you've seen these left-wing governments do is very steadily embrace. I mean, Lula's success, social success, is based on, you know, I mean, it's not simply about Lula. Fernando Henrique Cardoso preceded Lula, who by European standards is also a social democrat. Brazil is seen as being on the right, but you know, to all intents and purposes, Brazil's political divide is very much between two left-wing forces. Fernando Henrique Cardoso introduced many of the social policies that Lula inherited in 2002. Lula simply expanded these policies, expanded the scope of these policies to arguably make them more effective. It's a question of quantity becoming quality. You had, under Fernando Henrique Cardoso, for example, 2 to 3 million families benefiting from a social welfare program called Bolsa Familia, which is in Portuguese family basket, basically making a welfare payment dependent on a child attending school, going to a clinic, being vaccinated. So linking, and a payment generally paid direct to the mother, right? This policy was introduced, various programs introduced by Fernando Henrique Cardoso in Brazil in the 90s. Lula transformed that into it benefits 13 million Brazilian families, 12 to 13 million Brazilian families. It's now a huge phenomenon. Now, what Lula also did was introduced a minimum wage policy, together with the sort of the confidence that stemmed from the maintenance of economic stability, which again Cardoso had introduced, that allowed for the expansion of internal credit, and banks began to lend money to low-income groups for them to allowing them to buy, you know, cameras and you know, DVD players or whatever, and mobile phones, etc., etc. So you had a big expansion. So all these things are interlinked in different ways. Different countries in South America and Latin America more broadly have followed these kinds of policies. Mexico's got a policy very similar to Brazil's Bolsa Familia. Uruguay's got a policy, Argentina's got a policy, Chile's got a policy. Chile's made huge progress in eliminating, you know, extreme poverty, what the World Bank term extreme poverty, people living on less than $2 a day, has virtually eliminated it. You know, Brazil's made huge progress in taking people out of the lowest socioeconomic income groups, the D's and the E's into the C's. These are big changes.